Welcome to the Exceptional Insights podcast. I'm Sean Wargo, and I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Hansen.
Hello.
Together, we make up the market intelligence team here at Avixa,
where it's our job to identify trends in the economy and understand how they affect our industry, the professional audiovisual industry.
Hello, I'm Sean Wargo, and this is Peter Hansen from Avixa. We're back with another episode of Exceptional Insights, our podcast covering all the latest trends in Pro AV. As those of you that may have been following along have noticed that we recently published a meta report on post-COVID norms. So we thought it was a good time to look back at the issue of corporate collaboration, office spaces, utilization, technology, all that sort of stuff, and kind of refresh the conversation. So I think where we'll start today, Peter, if you can give us a sense for what is the meta telling us now about where we are, what's changed, what's new and different in our rollout of technology for collaboration.
Right. The corporate office space was kind of, from a vertical market perspective, the biggest long-term question as soon as the pandemic started. We did a report and it identified that space above all others as the place where there was going to likely be some permanent, meaningful change related to movement to remote and then long-term impacts of that. We've done multiple deep dives in our meta report now. And kind of early ones were saying, in 2021, 2022, our research was saying like, hey, the future is hybrid. It's not full remote. Not everyone's coming back. It's going to be this like kind of complex mixed picture. And that has really come true. I think we're not in a place of total certainty, but we're in a place where that like wide bell curve of takes, where there's some really, really negative doomsayers that I felt like we really had to push back against in 2021 and 2022. You're not hearing that as much. You're not seeing those sky is falling headlines anymore because we're seeing growing stability in the corporate office market. We're seeing growing stability in the sort of percent of days spent in office, the long-term plans of CEOs, executives related to what distribution they want their companies to have in terms of in-person, hybrid, remote. And so the most recent meta report is seeing now like that we've kind of settled in since 2022 through 2023. What are the new norms? Kind of like, what is the long-term future shaping up around in terms of, anything from conference room size, spoiler alert, small especially, medium definitely big, large less so, and then as well, technology stack, and in terms of challenges as well. A question like future-proofing, a question like, what is the most difficult thing to get right today? The sort of one guiding principle, a very much easier said than done type principle, is that anybody should be able to walk into the conference room, doesn't matter what their device is, get plugged in, and easily video conference as well. Also, whatever the platform is, because even if you're a Teams house, like if you're working with a client who's Zoom, like you need to be able to do that effectively. So it's kind of the age-old question of how can the technology get out of the way to really just facilitate the interaction, the successful, highly productive business that our end users want to be. That's a big part of the meta report. Some data on how that's evolving. Another big part, which we're going to get into later, is the rise of platform-based rooms. There's a lot of implications there. Really excited to talk about that here. But we're talking about the meta report so far, and how that's kind of supporting this story of growing confidence, growing stability, next phase for corporate office vertical, for conferencing collaboration. But that's not the only place where we're getting a lot of interesting, compelling new data about that next phase of corporate and about conferencing collaboration. What else are we seeing in Avixa's library? What other data is there.
Yeah, we are on the precipice of launching our new IOTA report, which will update the forecast for things like conference and collaboration and corporate marketplace as a whole. I think what we can touch on a little bit there is the macroeconomic environment that's sort of shaping what those forecasts might look like. What we talked about in 2023 was a little bit of a trough effect where we saw a slowdown in growth. Some of that was a result of an oversupply of product in 2022, a waiting for some categories to catch up in terms of their supply, a pretty good pipeline of work for integrators, but for manufacturers, they actually saw things slow down a little bit. And I think in conferencing and collaboration and corporate, that was definitely the case. Some of that, what we seem to be hearing from the marketplace is there was a wave of investment that happened in 21, 22, adaptations to an evolving normalization, right? We're still working on getting to that stable point that we're talking about now in the meta. So that meant companies seem to be holding off on some of their investments. So growth-wise, what our new forecasts are likely to show once they come out in May or June of this year is that 2023 growth is a little bit less than 22, and that actually, as we look forward, macroeconomics willing, I suppose, given things like interest rates and inflation, and honestly, even just corporate concern over possible recession threats, which are still there, right? It's not gone. It's just perhaps muted somewhat. So what we expect at this point is increased investment as we go through 24 into 25. I think what the question is underneath that I'd love to tease out today in this conversation is around this notion of volume or value, commoditization, custom versus standard. Those are some of the questions that come out, particularly as we look at platform-based rooms, which offer a standardized template approach, some vision, some core technologies, that sort of stuff, but may have some challenges, risks, or caveats for the market. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are you seeing perhaps on that kind of replacement cycle? Do you see more volume, or are you seeing more kind of value, or is it continuum? How does that play itself out?
Right. I think this is one of the biggest, most challenging questions for the channel. I think it's an area where there's potential for kind of a new, meaningful evolution in how corporate office and conferencing collaboration happens in reality. So the big players are, and we collected some data about the rise of Zoom and Teams, Room being the two leading platform-based rooms. And we asked the question, what percent of the pipeline is, Zoom rooms, capital Z, capital R, / Teams rooms, again, capitalized. So, being specific, trying to be specific about those products or, templates or whatever specific word is maybe quite right for that. And the channel in our survey said really about half. Which is funny because we've talked about that being half with a number of AV insiders, kind of executives now, and some have said, "Oh, that's silly that's high. That they're misinterpreting." And some be like, "Oh no, that's crazy that it's that low." Like that. So a little bit in the eye of the beholder, and but I think the key takeaway from that number is not that it's half. The key takeaway is that it's big now. If we'd asked that like capital R rooms, it'd be like a Zoom room. If we did that in 2018, 2019, a Teams room, they actually did exist pre-pandemic, but they just weren't on the radar the same way that it's fundamental now. And it being fundamental now has some substantial implications. And we collected data on a couple of dichotomies about what that means in terms of uniformity of design, ease of installation, and then what it means for manufacturer kind of interchangeability. And in each of those three cases, we saw data that I think poses a fundamental challenge for the channel. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of like the basic economics, kind of like the first step of thinking about the rise of these platform rooms. And I think that some of those fundamentals fall into the challenge category, that this is difficult for the channel a little bit more in terms of margin rather than like total revenue. But a challenge, frankly, for both achieving their numbers. Now, that's the first part of the conversation, and I want to be like super clear as I talk about like, oh, this is a little negative, this is difficult for the channel, etc. That there's a second part of this conversation. I'm going to pass it over to you to talk about that, but it's also super important, and it gives a lot of optimism for like long-term margin, long-term revenue. So as I go into sort of like why this is going to be difficult for the AV integrator of today, for the manufacturer of today, I want folks to keep in mind that this is one start of the perspective. It's a key part, but it's not the end of the conversation. That there's a lot of positivity out there. So let's talk about where the challenge comes from. That first dichotomy: more uniform design, less uniform design. The data was really strongly pointing towards more uniform design. That's not to say all Microsoft Teams rooms are the same, or all Zoom rooms are the same, Cisco rooms, whatever. They're flexible. They understand that spaces are different. They understand that like there's a difference between a boardroom and like a basic huddle space. But that with the kind of like template, it's designed to be moddable. It's designed to be a little simpler, maybe a little bit more friendly even to an IT integrator. That design is easier. And if design is easier, that's a challenge for an integrator. A lot of the best revenue and the best margin came on design, that differentiation that set yourselves and your expertise apart. So that's a challenge from a fundamental perspective. And then ease of integration. The data pointed less strongly than it pointed towards uniform design, but also towards ease of installation. And that's a credit to these platforms, like making it cheaper, easier to just get the ball rolling. But again, that's what integrators were good at. They were these experts at it, but now it's easier. So what makes the integrator quite so special if integration is easy? So that's another challenge in terms of revenue, in terms of margin. You're less differentiated as an AV integrator being an expert at that. If it's easy, why not go in-house? Why not use that IT integrator who's really good at volume, already plugged in, but doesn't have the AV expertise that used to set you apart maybe a little bit more? Last part, that manufacturing, again, a smaller margin than even for the ease of installation, but pointing towards easier to swap out manufacturers. So once you have this like kind of like ecosystem established, and manufacturers are unable to differentiate by like so much for spec exactly. It's more of just, I am certified to fit into this ecosystem. It's a little bit more difficult to differentiate. It's a little bit pushing more towards competition on price. Again, just a challenge for how can you compete there. Those are some fundamental challenges, I think, for different parts of the channel. How can you be differentiated? How can you keep charging that margin when design is easier, installation is easier, it's easier to swap out different manufacturers? That's the maybe like a little bit of the negative side, but there's also a lot of opportunity. So I'm going to pass it over to you. Let's talk about where that positivity is. Like, okay, so there's this kind of some initial challenges maybe on startup, but there's big opportunities on like long-term revenue, long-term margin through this. What are those?
Yeah, I think so. Several things are playing out, right? If we think about where we are in the life cycle of all of this evolution, it kind of makes sense that the first, say, task, the first problem to solve is scalability, is replicability, all those sorts of things. We knew before the pandemic, it's still the case. There's a large percentage of meeting rooms that are not even video enabled as of yet. They were kind of up for that kind of upgrade and re-kitting even before the pandemic hit. The pandemic accelerated that. And so there remained the challenge of we need to figure out an easy way, an efficient way, a scalable way to equip all these spaces. So I think platforms help solve that first and foremost need. It was, let's get out of the gate, offer companies a volume option for those big scalable, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to kit all of our spaces. The next evolution, I think, is where we start to get more into that continuum or end of the continuum towards customization. So as integrators become more familiar with the tools, become more familiar with the platforms, new features roll out, new products roll out, the palette of paints increases, right? So the number, if we each hardware option, each design template is a both a palette and a set of paints that you can use to go after a solution. Over time, I think it becomes possible, as you mentioned already, to accommodate for the individual needs of a company, their business model, their amount of hybrid, their workflows, their spaces that they have in their offices, which we know, of course, the data is showing there's been a move up market into more Class A, especially new construction. So all of that is creating an opportunity for that customized approach, which is where we get to the sweet spot for integration. Integration has never been about volume play. By and large, it's mystery is margin, all those sorts of things. Complexity breeds the customizability. But I think we're now going to get into that stage where there's a lot more of that customized approach available to an integrator installer to bring in their expertise, help figure out the right microphone placement, help figure out the right camera placement, the right lighting, the right network configuration. All those sorts of things are aspects that play to the sweet spot, play to the strength of an integrator, and therefore equal the kind of long-term opportunity for upgrade pathing that we see here. You add on top of that the whole layer of AI and data. So many of the new products and tool sets are offering integrators the ability to remote monitor, manage upgrade pathing, look at device utilization, uptime, downtimes, recommend a replacement cycle for it. So all of that starts to open up recurring revenue streams. So the holy grail of integration has always been, how do we move away from plug and play, project, just quick project work, individual transactional project work that you put in, you kind of set and forget for maybe 7 years. You come back and you do some a rekitting or an upgrading. Now we're talking about more compressed replacement cycles because powered by data and analytics that help us keep a better sense for what's needing to be changed and swapped out. You add to that kind of the overall dynamic of office spaces need to be differentiated from the home working environment. There was a compelling reason, forced in some cases, to just stay remote during the pandemic for safety reasons. We've come back to the office, and I think employees are realizing we need something meaningfully better and different from just working from home or whatever. So that also creates a compelling reason for companies to invest in how to differentiate those experiences, utilize new technology, tools, products, et cetera, to further differentiate that. So overall, that makes me optimistic. I think it helps with this story of, even as it's showing out in the data right now, the perspective is, gosh, there's less design needed, it's more standardized, maybe it's more commoditized. That's okay, I think, for where we've been, which has been a little bit more about getting lots of space, kind of getting quick. But we're hearing more and more from the marketplace. Now there's a need to go back and look again and make use of the evolution of technology to further improve upon the experience. So that makes me a little more bullish on the long term, I think, for Pro AV. But let's talk about that. What are there other challenges? Where are we with this notion of commoditization? Is that a sort of real current present danger for us as an industry, or what are you seeing kind of play out in that?
Yeah, I think I really want to build on what you're talking about in terms of kind of that refresh cycle. One thing you didn't quite say, I think, to the extent I believe in it, is the opportunity for managed services through this.
Yes, definitely.
So it's, let's talk about platform-based room. There's not that much margin in the design. You're just kind of like working off a template. It's easier. You can't charge that much for that. It's highly competitive. The installation, again, it's easier. It's highly competitive. Can't charge that much for that. But then what happens through the cycle? The platform-based, software is that's going to be updating and potentially quite rapidly. I mean, if you think about, I remember the first time I used Teams meetings was I swear it was the first time it was in the pandemic, but right about now, 4 years ago, I was starting to use Teams, and I was like, I cannot believe I have to use Teams instead of Zoom. It was so bad. And by like 6 months after that, like I was like, wow, Teams is like super good. It's now very competitive with Zoom. Personal perspective here. This is not a, professional AV opinion on this. But my point is that there's been a massive evolution, and that was like in a number of months. And so you think about, the historical refresh cycle was 7 years for the technology. In 4 years, Teams is totally different. Zoom, I don't have the same story because I would like remember being impressed early on it, and I like still find those calls are great, whatever. But I know that the technologies that platform's really evolved. So you think about next 4 years, next 7 years, like good gracious, the platform's gonna be so different. So if you want to have a successful, ongoing platform-based room, it really seems obvious that the hardware is going to have to keep up with the evolving software. And so that's begging for an integrator to manage it, to keep everything up to date, to keep it as seamless as it was the day you installed. And that's crying out for managed services. And managed services is always going to have a better margin than just a pure installation job.
Yeah.
And then as well, you think about refresh cycle. One of the reasons it was, maybe 7 years before is there's a pretty big barrier when it's like, okay, like is now the time? You kind of like, you wait until you have to do the technology refresh. And then it's like, okay, we got to get the capital expenditure tight budget. This is the year we're doing the conference rooms. It's a big barrier. But when it's a managed service contract, it's just part of the OpEx. It's built out. It's a lot more frictionless. So instead of it just being like, wait until the last moment because there's a big transaction cost, like internally getting our ducks in order, it's like, that's pretty seamless. So you have a shorter, more IT style refresh cycle because it's way more seamless. And it's way more needed as well as these platforms continue to evolve and advance, especially as you talk about factors like AI, data analytics, that are, sprinkling into these platforms right now, but are definitely the wave of the future. And definitely, how we talk about like 4 years ago, start of the pandemic, what Teams was like. 4 years from now, what Teams, Zoom, Cisco, Meet, whatever you want to say is going to be like 4 years from now. Like those are going to be important parts. And I can't but assume that manufacturing is going to have to do new impressive things to keep up with that, and corporations are going to want to spend on it to realize through hardware the advances in software. So I think that's one of the big areas where there's opportunity. Now, the one other point I want to make about that is like we're talking about this like it's going to be a big volume serving these platform-based rooms, like really careful on margin for design, for installation, but then you're going to have to manage and make money off of like managed services, keeping that up to date. That's a challenge, and especially as you're aligning to like maybe a specific platform or a couple platforms. I think what I hope a lot of listeners are hearing is reasons for kind of scale. Like it's an advantage for like a big business that kind of really focuses in on the Teams room, the Zoom room, the whatever room play. They get super efficient at it and can handle all parts of that contract. They can do a little bit IT style work for that. But that means that there's a little bit of, for me, I think hollowing out of maybe the middle ground where a lot of like medium-sized integrators are today, where they do some volume, they're efficient, not super efficient, not perfect on margin, but they're good. But they also do some of that like true custom, ad hoc, really like margin from mystery type work. I think that kind of like play in both fields is going to be challenged. I think that what you're going to see is there's going to be like the kind of the obvious volume type players. And then there's going to be players who say, I don't really do volume. I'm not an expert on like razor thin margins or razor thin efficiency or super sharp efficiency to maintain those margins. But I'm really like good at custom, the complex space, the specific needs with a little bit less of like that playing both kind of fields type play. That's one of like the long-term implications I see, even as like both of these sides remain like super profitable. I think, especially that managed services, like keeping up to date on the volume play, in quotes volume play, because there's a lot more to it than that. But I think that's going to be the big business side. And then on the other side, it's going to be a little bit more like the traditional AV integrator type picture, but this even more specialization into like we do custom. We're not like, if you just want to kit out a bunch of Teams rooms and manage that, like we're probably not the integrator for you. We're just not oriented around that model because that's going to be a very specific model, different from the traditional integrator model.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. Absolutely agree that there's clear opportunity for managed service. In fact, our forecasts over the last several versions have really shown that as one of the highest areas of growth compounded growth rate, particularly as you look at an area like corporate or conference and collaboration, it's right up there. And so 100% agree that while it's a slow transition, I think we're still sort of seeing it evolve in the marketplace. And some of that is contract sophistication, it's resourcing, it's setting up your own capabilities to work with the tools, the platforms, to use the platform management software, the AI, all the things that you need to become more sophisticated in. The other thing we're hearing about from the marketplace in terms of that sort of rapid release of new feature is just the sheer reality of trying to keep up with that, keep trained up on it. We have, of course, now ANP certification. We've got Microsoft Teams Room training that we offer as ways to help integrators kind of keep up with the latest. But feature sets are continuing to come out at a rapid rate that integrators then have to train their clientele on. Another great case for a managed service offering, as is the issue of cybersecurity and just updates, right? Keeping up with all the updates across the various firmware and software applications that are involved, making sure that your customer is staying as bulletproof as possible to risk of intrusion and hacking. But I would say one thing I might challenge a little bit is the notion of whether or not there is a strong opportunity for design, because however much there is also going to aid the middle. I think that middle ground that you're talking about, we kind of have this bifurcation of all volume, strict custom. I think there's one of the perhaps fallacies of a platform-based room is that it's all templated. When you actually look at it and you look at kind of what's being proposed, it's kind of suggestive models for how you might configure, like the desk layout, the spatial layout, the table, the chairs, the camera placement. But ultimately, there's a lot of configuration. There's a lot of, there's only so much you can do with, say, correction. Audio is a great example of this. The closer we are to our microphone, the better the better it's going to record. And so you can correct for that after in post recording through, manipulation and adjustment. But even better if you have more microphones in the room to kind of reference and point to. This is classic live events recording type of issues. So that's where the integrator and their knowledge, the AV integrator, comes in, especially early on in the process, to really help understand what is the intended use for this room. Where does it need to fall on the continuum of good enough versus exceptional, right? And that's a lot of the debate going on right now is what is good enough? You could put a central camera/microphone in the middle of the room, but if it's a long table, that's not going to necessarily work for on the fringes, on the remote, right? On the farthest edges of that space. So as an integrator installer, expert in audio and video, you're going to be able to recommend, hey, to get a better experience, why don't we put more microphone arrays throughout the room? Why don't we do a couple of different cameras? Why don't we use software in this type of configuration? You know what? We need some better lighting or correction for incoming light. All those sorts of things offer that design capability that I think is where we start to have the art meets science of integrator coming in and yes, perhaps being able to kind of play in the middle ground between a volume and a value, a custom, but really help configure. I think that jury is still out. I think it's still early because even the concepts themselves, the market's still reacting to what are they involved. Hardware companies are getting their devices certified, feature sets are rolling out, there's some cool new stuff coming. So I think it's still a moving target a little bit, but I would submit in defense of custom, I suppose, or in defense of that opportunity in the middle, that there's still something there. That platform by itself doesn't negate. I would also add to that, you and I have talked about the notion of further specialization. So we've always said diversify to overcome, the peaks and valleys of different trends in the market. But there's also something to be said for, what about somebody who develops an expertise in how to support a legal type of customer who's in legal offices, has to work with documents in a certain way, collaborate in a certain way, versus, say, healthcare or finance or other kind of more niche markets. So that may also evolve kind of in local fashion, a specialist who can come in and really help you, understands those workflows, and can think beyond just the space itself and the integrated technology to how does that need to play into the bigger picture of workflow optimization. That's something I've heard talked about more and more at places like ISE and Infocom conference tracks, is not just, say, smart building, but smart office workflows. All that sort of stuff is kind of the next of conference and collaboration technologies, not just about hardware integration, but also that workflow optimization. So I think there's something there too, potentially.
Yeah.
Still, it's a +5. I think at this point on managed services and what that can bring as a revenue source, but kind of teasing out some of the other underlying opportunity I think we see in the market.
I think to build on what you're saying about the ongoing space for the designer in a platform room dominated conference and collaboration space, is that, if it were easy to just make it a templated type, simple, just Control C, Control V thing, it would have been done years ago. Mm-hmm. There were big margins to be made for the big integrators who would probably have the scale to create a template and then apply it with all their clients. Like, if they could have, they probably would have. But they didn't. And that means that it's hard, right? And that means that, in 2024, in 2030, in 2035, there's going to be this ongoing challenge of like, okay, there's some like template, and like it maybe probably does cut down on some of the scale of the difficulty of design, but there's always going to be the need for someone who really understands the way spaces work, the way the templates work, the formula, the approach, the platform, and then what the end user needs are to create the synthesis that makes that work together. Mm-hmm. And I think, I hope folks are hearing in there about how, these, the platforms need the channel. They need a strong channel because, right now we're having this like big build out of these platform-based rooms. And they're trying to like, proof of concept, you can just do this room and it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be better. It's going to be really successful, but it has to work. Like if they disappoint their clients now, it's going to be really difficult when they're going back to the well in 4 years from now. Time to refresh, time to, keep paying your license fees, stick with our platform if it doesn't work well. So they need that strong channel to just make sure that like it really is, kind of the concepts that they've built are applied on site in a way that's successful, that meets the needs that the end user has and throughout the life cycle of the product. So there's definitely that synergy there of interest between really all parts of the channel.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is so there's one of the beauties of a platform-based solution set is standardization and common language, right? So it gives the channel what they need to have common reference point standards built in. This is something that the industry often looks for or tries to develop, is standards around certain things, so that when you're going to have the conversation about how you might deploy technology in space for optimal effect, minimizing downtime, minimizing risk of hack and all those the other kind of intrusion stuff. It's the standards that allow you to have those conversations. So I do think that that's the strength here. While it can initially feel, standards often can feel at first confining, but then over time, it's more just becomes common language that then can be built upon from there. With that in mind, as we kind of wrap up today, so our sort of softball question is: all this stuff is great. What are we each seeing in terms of cool new technology that in this conferencing collaboration space that's kind of hearkening the future? I'll go first. I think the thing that I love is really watching these multi-camera, multi-mic sort of solutions. Sometimes they're conferencing hubs that sit in the middle of the room, but just watching how they're evolving with their usage of built-in algorithms, AI for camera angle optimization, orientation to speaker or to presenter or to certain person in the room based upon not just voice, but actual structure, body structure, head, shoulders, sort of stuff. You're seeing that really come into the market, ultimately with the outcome of producing that meeting equity that we've always yearned for. Many of us, I'm sure those listeners out there can think of calls where there's a bunch of you in the office, you're in a boardroom, kind of bowling alley style, and then there's one person who's remote, and they're the big head at the front of the room on the screen, and how awkward and uncomfortable that is for pretty much everyone, but particularly for those one or two or three or whoever's remote. So offering the ability now to break up the room and give you much more of that single speaker, single pane sort of perspective equalizes the experience once again, regardless of whether in an office or remote. So I think technologies like that from any noted brand, pick yours, that might come up. But that's the sort of thing that I see as pretty cool. How about you? What's your pick?
For me, when we started talking about this, my thoughts went straight to AI, especially kind of like the AI companions for meetings where they're in the background doing not just transcription, but also sort of summarization, task takeaways. We actually did a meta report on AI, and it kind of said like timeout on like unmonitored AI. It's like the key in terms of like it's predictable when hallucinations happen. This like issue where AI just makes stuff up, and that's when there's mystery. But when you're just like, I'm just tuning into the conversation, I'm listening to the conversation and highlighting the key points, there's not really mystery there. It's like, here is the population of words and things that were discussed, and all I have to do is figure out like what was repeated the most. What were the things people said or said and ooh to, and then like condensed to that. So it's the kind of the structure of the task is something that AI is going to be very good at. And then what also really excites me from, as an AV industry person is, what does that mean for kitting out? You talked about like not all conference rooms, like a pretty low percentage of conference rooms are like fully kitted out for video conferencing or at a minimum audio conferencing. But like, what does that mean is like, if it's good, that means that every meeting should be on it. Isn't it worthwhile to have a super competent note taker, not just say what was said, but like, here are the key points, and FYI, these are the takeaways, and maybe even the timeline if that was spoken in the meeting. That's super valuable, and that's just another kind of tailwind for that these platforms are creating for making AV necessary to the way offices are run, the way meetings are run. So for me, that's something that stands out as exciting.
That's very cool. Yeah, so I guess we should all be prepared for a world where Siri, Alexa, and the others, Copilot, are telling us more and more what to do, following up after meetings. But I think a welcome part of just further workforce development and productivity tool sets. Well, as always, of course, come to InfoComm to see some of the latest technology like we're talking about, to get a sense for the latest tech. Take a look at that meta for Q1 of the post-COVID norms to get a sense for where we are in that rollout and kind of evolution. Otherwise, join us next time on Xceptional Insights, where we explore yet another topic driving our Pro AV industry. Thank you and be well.